That is what the crux of the issue was that got this going.
But you can't just say, Jan, you can't say ticked off as if it was a minor squabble. It led to Russia literally rolling tanks into another country. It was an invasion. We were telling you yesterday at this time how Donald Trump was saying that Ukraine shouldn't have started the war with Russia. People wondered if he'd said more than he had intended. Would he try to walk it back, as the saying goes? Well, have a listen to some of his latest words on President Zelensky.
But think of it, a modestly successful comedian. President Zelensky talked the United States of America into spending $350 billion to go into a war that basically couldn't be won. He refuses to have elections, is low in the real Ukrainian polls. I mean, how can you be high with every city is being demolished? It's hard to be high. Somebody said, oh, no, his polls are good. Give me a break. A dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. Got to move fast because that war is going in the wrong direction.
Jan Harper-Hayes is the former global VP of Republicans overseas. She advised Trump's 2016 transition team. She may soon be making her way back to DC as well, and we can speak to her now. Jan, good morning to you.
Good morning.
What do you make of Trump's view of Zelensky? Why does he have such distaste for Zelensky?
Well, Zelensky the other day said that Trump lives in the disinformation world. He put his foot down and said he was upset because he wasn't invited to Saudi Arabia. I'm not sure that I would say that Trump hates Zelensky. I would say that he doesn't have a lot of respect for him.
He called him a dictator, which he isn't. Why does he say that, do you think?
Well, I think that he made that comment, even though under martial law elections are canceled, he hasn't been willing to negotiate. He's put his foot down. He's not going to negotiate. You have Marco Rubio, John Ratcliffe, who's head of the CIA, and Mike Waltz of the NSC, and they are all trying to negotiate with Zelensky. And Zelensky's proposals, or Ukraine's proposals, are to either the extreme or they don't flush out enough details. And all he's doing is playing with Zelensky.
But the point is that they're not negotiating with Zelensky because Zelensky was not invited there. Those guys, Rubio, went to Saudi Arabia to negotiate with Lavrov. Zelensky wasn't invited. That's one of the problems, isn't it? That they're not negotiating with Ukraine.
Oh, well, I just said that, okay, you've got Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, you've got John Radcliffe, and you've got Mike Waltz. They are in charge of negotiating with Ukraine. You've got General Keith Kellogg, and he is working with Ukraine and Europe. So what Zelensky is upset about is that Trump is talking to one side and will talk to Zelensky, but Zelensky thought he should be at the table at first. But this is the first conversation Trump has had. You need to understand what both sides want.
But he's not just not talking to Zelensky. He's calling him a dictator. He's saying he's going to lose the country if he doesn't get a move on. He said he started the war when Ukraine was invaded by Russia, which the whole world saw. If you were Zelensky, you'd be thinking,
wait a minute.
Go on.
Wait a minute. I know the Biden administration said that this was unprovoked. Let's just be clear on what this was. The person or the people that poked the bear to get this started were the U.S. diplomats, some in the Biden administration, and mostly NATO. What was ticking off Russia was including Ukraine in NATO. When there had been a promise in 1990 from Mitterrand, from Thatcher, from Kohl of Germany, from Baker, who was Secretary of State, and from Bush 41, that there would not be an encroachment. That is what the crux of the issue was that got this going.
But you can't just say, Jan, you can't say ticked off as if it was a minor squabble. It led to Russia literally rolling tanks into another country. It was an invasion. It was an invasion of a country. It's not a question of being ticked off. Do we not live in a world? It's interesting. Does Trump think this or not? Do we live in a world where it's acceptable for one country to roll tanks into another?
I think you're missing the point as to what actually started the war. And if you don't look at the fact that NATO was talking about expanding, which goes against an agreement made in 1990, then you're missing the whole point.
But we also promised Ukraine. We also promised Ukraine in the 2000s that we would support it, whatever happened, as a reason for it giving up its nuclear arsenal. We said we'd support its territorial integrity, and we've not really done that particularly well. I just wonder whether you think that the possible expansion of NATO is a cause of the war. In fact, you could also make the case that the actual expansion of NATO, countries like Finland and Sweden, has been a consequence of the war.
You can, if you're not willing to understand it from the Russian perspective, that if Ukraine went into NATO, then there would be NATO troops along the Russian border. That was unacceptable, and it goes against any kind of security.
And does that justify the invasion?
I'm not trying to justify the invasion. I mean, gosh, we're talking about emotional issues here instead of looking from a historical perspective.
I don't think it's emotional to work, because you say that he's got to understand Putin, which I think is a really interesting notion. That it's not emotional to explore. It's a fascinating one to explore, because some people are saying, Jan, that Donald Trump understands Putin too well. He's pro-Putin. Everything he says is what Putin thinks. He very seldom says what Zelensky might think or what NATO allies might think. He actually says what Putin thinks, and he's too close to Putin is the argument.
He just asked Zelensky to give him an accounting of how the $350 million were used, and Zelensky could not provide that. You think that made Trump very happy?
So do you think he wants to get rid of Zelensky?
I don't think he cares. I don't. I think he wants peace. That's what he wants. He wants this war to stop. He wants people to stop dying.
Does he want peace at any cost? I think that's fair, because the people who defend Trump say he wants to move this from a war that's not going anywhere, and the criticism of the West has been they didn't support Ukraine enough, actually, so they never got to a point where Ukraine could win the war, so the Western support was always just going to prolong the war. Trump at least wants to end it. Some people think he wants to end it, and he's happy to end it on Russian terms. That's the criticism.
Well, that is the criticism, but when you look at it, and he's got all these people working on it, he just wants to, he doesn't favor Russia. And when people look at it from a biased standpoint, so each time I try to bring up how the diplomats got involved, how the Biden administration got involved, you can go back to 2014 when they got rid of the president, and they wanted someone that was not pro-Russia. There had been a pro-Russian president. If you had a pro-Russian president in Ukraine, you would be more inclined to have peace.
And do you think that's what that and I think that crystallized it exactly. That's what Trump wants, isn't it? Let's cut aside a lot of the rhetoric. It makes Trump's life easier if Zelensky's out and a pro-Russian is in.
No. I'm going back on a historical.
I know you are, but but the point you're making, I think, is valid now. That strikes me. That's what's in the heart of the Trump position here. Get Zelensky out. Let's have a pro-Russian in. Everything goes quiet.
Well, let's just have someone that wants peace.
But at what cost? At what cost, Jan? Neville Chamberlain wanted peace in 1938, is the argument. You can have peace, but peace isn't always the only answer if the alternative is worse.
Well, obviously, you're more on the side that you think it's okay for this war to continue.
I'm just interested in unpicking the motivation of the Trump side of things, because the criticism, as you know, which I'm trying to explore with you, is that he's too pro-Russian. So, for example, he's called Zelensky a dictator. He's never called Putin a dictator, whereas Putin is elected in widely recognised as dodgy system. He's not actually a freely elected leader. He's someone who distorts the democratic process. That's accepted as a point of fact. So he's more of a dictator than Zelensky is. And yet I can't find any account of Trump calling Putin a dictator, but he calls Zelensky a dictator. That's interesting, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and if I got up at this hour of the morning to discuss whether we name call people as opposed to understanding what the issues are.
But Trump's been name called. I'm only using the phrase dictator because Trump literally called him that name.
Okay, so is that worth 15 minutes of news?
I think, yes, it probably is. If, as you say, there's been hundreds of billions of dollars spent, hundreds of thousands of lives lost, we're trying to find an end to it, and one person, the most powerful man in the world, is accusing one side of the conflict of being a dictator. I think that is news, because it speaks to the question of how are we going to get out of this, and does Trump want to get out of it at any cost, even appeasing Russia? Because that's the criticism. And the more we sort of talk around that feels like that would be an acceptable price to pay, I suppose. Jan, I don't think you necessarily accept that, do you? But that's what the feeling of some people is.
If we're talking feelings, I completely understand that those are feelings. I am not pro-Russia or pro-Ukraine. I am more interested in looking at what has transpired before Donald Trump, going back many, many decades, that have allowed for this to happen. NATO is probably going to be unhappy if this war ends. They don't want it to end. Our military-industrial complex definitely doesn't want it to end because, one of the reasons that America goes in and helps other countries, there is a nefarious part of it. The CIA trained people so that, and they like these wars going on because then we can give them loans. Then after those loans, we can bankrupt them so they're totally dependent upon us. We have economic hitmen that the CIA have used, and Trump is trying to put a stop to that.
Jan, I understand the points that you're making. It's very useful to get this perspective. We're trying to understand everyone's side in the argument over the course of this morning. Thank you for joining us.
I enjoyed it.
So did I. Jan Harper-Hayes there, the former global VP of Republicans overseas. She may well be on her way back to work in the Trump administration.
There's something interesting happening if you read American media over the course of the last couple of days, which is that a number of Republicans have started to come out talking about how uncomfortable they are with what Donald Trump is saying. It's tentative and it's not necessarily a sea change, but it may well be the start of something. Nikki Haley is the latest. Now, it's fair to say that she has been critical of Trump since he was elected. She did vote for Donald Trump. She's been critical of some of his picks for his top team. She's criticised a number of men, for example, in his top team. She's tweeted overnight saying that what Trump has been saying are classic Russian talking points and exactly what Putin wants. And I think, if we start to see more people, more in the Republican Party doing that, then that could become a problem.
Yeah, really interesting. And also the fact that it's very striking. He calls one side of the argument a dictator and not the other one. And that really, it must suggest something, mustn't it?
Yeah.